what could a Navy SEAL look like in 10 years?
How long do you think it'll be before we see exoskeletons on the battlefield?
Last night, I ran a sub 8 mile in an exoskeleton. It sends a signal wirelessly to a patch I have on my arm that fully fires this tendon and makes me pull my trigger finger.
Totally mind blown, right? That's holy shit.
Remember I said robots can do the jobs that a 90-year-old man can do?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they're going to eventually do the job that a 70-year-old man can do. And then eventually they'll be able to do what like a average in-shape 50-year-old man can do. To build humanoid robots that can do what a Navy SEAL in the prime of his life, probably secretly roided out, like that's a really high bar for a robot to hit, especially when it comes to his ability to break the rules or make a decision that wasn't programmed or decide that he's going to do something that a robot's just never going to do. My intuition here is like that's going to be the last job to be figured out. It's a little bit like, it's not a perfect example, but it's like is AI going to replace like the jobs of our politicians? It's like, that's probably like the last thing to go. Like in a very real sense, there's certain parts of our society that are almost like envoys of America. They represent what we're doing. And I think that we're not going to outsource that to robots anytime soon.
So we're a long ways out from replacing a tier 1 assaulter.
I think we're a long way out. And
what is a long way out?
30, 40, 50 years minimum. There's some things that move fast and others that don't, but I mean, because here's the other thing you have to remember, and I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, but you're also able to augment people. So the right comparison is not Navy SEAL of today versus robot 10 years from now. It's what could a Navy SEAL look like in 10 years in terms of their biological modifications or conditioning, in terms of their mental modifications or conditioning, things like exoskeletons, things like more advanced mobility, things like more advanced small arms. All of those are going to make the Navy SEAL a moving target as well. So the robots would have to get not just as good as a SEAL of today, they're gonna have to be as good of a SEAL of that era. And I think we're gonna keep investing in the guys on the ground, hopefully a lot more than we have been. Like,
you're involved with exoskeletons, correct?
Well, I don't know how I just ran a sub 8 minute mile for the first time in my life. And I'm usually the guy who's wheezing to do a sub 10 minute mile. And last night I ran a sub 8 mile in an exoskeleton that basically it ran out of thermal capacity 2/3 of the way through the run. So the last third of the run, I was actually going slower than I normally would run. But the first 2/3 were so fast, I still did some. So actually, when I go home tonight, I'm going to be making some mods to the cooling system that the company. I don't want to badmouth the company. I think that they made a mistake on the cooling system. And so I'm going to be doing some mods tonight that I already have the parts sitting in the garage for, and I think I'm going to run a sub 7 mile. Anyway, I'm like an out of shape fatty. And if I'm able to just like put on a exoskeleton and run a 7 minute mile, imagine what that could do on a Navy SEAL. The same thing for augmenting vision. Right now, the night vision capabilities that we give our warfighters are not that far removed from what we had in the 90s, right? It's still Gen 3 night vision. Sure, it's white phosphor instead of green, and it's a little higher res and a little higher gain, but it generationally, it's the same. Imagine what happens when you can take that Navy SEAL and you can put on a visor that gives him full peripheral vision at night in the thermal spectrum, the visible spectrum, the ultraviolet spectrum, the hyperspectral spectrum. He's able to identify individual materials, components, vehicles, see all of his buddies, see all of the bad guys, and have information seamlessly shared between him and every other weapon and robot and vehicle on the battlefield. Like, that is where the Navy SEAL is going to be in just a few years. I think it's going to be hard for robots to compete with that guy.
So how does the exoskeleton work?
So different exoskeletons work in different ways. This particular one basically is sensing your motion based on your actual motion, and then it tries to predict. It actually has an onboard AI algorithm that is trying to predict what you're doing, and then it applies force that matches. Like you use power steering, right? Mm-hmm. You make a motion, it feels that torque, and then it adds more power to it to zero it out. It's actually not that different than that. Imagine if you had power steering, but instead of just for turning a wheel and grinding your tires, imagine it was every joint on your body. So you say, okay, I'm lifting, I'm doing this, and it says, oh, he's trying to do that. I'm going to add more power in. There's more advanced techniques that start to actually read your muscles before they even move. Because when you tell your muscles to move, it takes time for them to respond. That's going to be the future of exoskeletons. It's going to be measuring your body so that instead of there being a delay where I move, it feels it, and then it helps me, it's going to be seamlessly integrated with you, maybe even starting to move your arm before your natural muscles are doing it.
Wow.
That's what, like, then the crazy thing is eventually, someday, and I think this is way out just for a variety of basically invasive surgical reasons, eventually you'll be able to read those signals right from the brain directly. So Matt, like right now, you have a lot of latency in your motion that you don't perceive it. You think there's no latency in your body. There's actually a couple hundred milliseconds of latency in your movements that your brain just ignores and tells you is fine. Imagine a world where you're wearing an exoskeleton where the moment your brain is telling your arm to move, the exoskeleton starts moving your arm. You could potentially make someone who's literally 10 times faster at moving or reacting. And that again, you see where I'm getting? Like that's going to be the Navy SEAL of the future. And that guy is going to be a beast.
Holy shit.
I've actually got a very small scale version of this. I built a system that measures when you are trying.
Security guys running around with this stuff?
We have a great security team, but I probably shouldn't talk about methods and tactics on them. I built a device many years ago, and I've screwed around with it a lot of times. It basically is a small sensor that you can mount that is able to tell when you are flexing muscles on your face. And I hooked that up to another electrical actuator. You ever use like a TENS unit for like therapy?
Yes.
So I hooked up something that's a lot like a TENS unit, but it's just rigged a little differently. So that instead of making your muscles vibrate, it is made to just trigger individual muscle groups. Like it can just basically make you, pull this finger or pull that finger. And I made it so that whenever I even barely start to flex a muscle up here in my face, it sends a signal wirelessly to a patch I have on my arm that fully fires this tendon and makes me pull my trigger finger. Now the thing is, if I do this normally, like if I normally am telling my trigger finger to go, that signal has to go from my brain, down my spinal cord, out through all these nervous cords, out into my arm. That actually takes a really, really long time. There's something called nervous transit velocity or nervous conduction velocity. It's how fast you can send signals down your peripheral nervous system. By building a bypass for it, I can make it where I can actually, if I want to pull the trigger on my gun, I can flex that muscle on my head, which is much closer to my brain, therefore a much, much shorter pathway. And I can actually shave a ton of latency off the delay between when I see something when I pull my trigger. All of a sudden, I've now reduced effectively, because you're familiar with like lock time in a firearm. It's like lock time is the time between when you pull a trigger and when the round is actually going. And different, if you have like a really heavy hammer, you can have a higher lock time. And so if you're looking at a target, you're pulling that trigger, you have some inaccuracy that is caused purely by the lock time, when you told it to fire and when it actually fires. And you can learn it out to some degree by kind of predicting all this together. I can not only be faster, I can even be more accurate by just removing that latency. Lock time, we pretend it's actually just the gun. Your real lock time is signal from your brain to when you pull the trigger to when the trigger reacts. And there's a lot of things we can do. So when I talked about biological modifications and mechanical modifications, there's things that we're going to be able to do that are going to eventually have your brain, telling you to fire some weapon, and the weapon will be fired and out the barrel and hitting the target before you would have, a traditional guy would have been able to even pull the trigger. So it's an exciting future.
Wow. I'm totally mind blown, right? That's holy shit.
It's some good.
How long do you think it'll be before we see exoskeletons on the battlefield?
So I do have to admit that I have said in the past that exoskeletons, the time has probably come and gone. This is a public prediction that I've made. My belief was that exoskeletons were probably something that made sense in the 80s and the 90s if we would have invested in them, but that at this point, we probably should just move to humanoid robotics and just have them remotely controlled by people. Like, I will say, by the way, we're going to have remotely controlled Navy SEAL robots long before you have, the AI controlled robot.
No matter where you're watching Shawn Ryan Show from, if you get anything out of this, please like, comment, subscribe, and most importantly, share this everywhere you possibly can. And if you're feeling extra generous, please leave us a review on Apple and Spotify podcasts.